Welcome back to the channel. There are stories that do not begin with tragedy, but with light. Sister Cathy Cesnik's story was one of them. Before her name became part of one of Maryland's most haunting mysteries, she was simply a teacher, the kind who made classrooms feel safe and alive. Born in Pittsburgh in 1942, Cathy grew up in a close, faith-filled family. Her early life was quiet, but it carried a sense of purpose. She joined the School Sisters of Notre Dame while still young, drawn by a conviction that faith was not only about prayer, it was about presence. Her students at Archbishop Keough High School in Baltimore would later describe her as the kind of person who listened before she spoke and who treated every girl as if she mattered. She taught English and drama, and she had a gift for finding meaning in small things. A line from Shakespeare, a moment on stage, a poem read out loud. She used them to help her students see beauty and courage in themselves. It was not unusual for her to stay after school, helping a shy student find her voice or guiding the school's drama club as they rehearsed late into the evening. But what stood out most about Sister Cathy was not her role as a nun or even as a teacher. It was her empathy. Her students later said she had a way of looking at you that made you feel seen, a rare and quiet kind of attention. For young women growing up in the 1960 seconds, when authority often meant silence, she offered a different example: gentle, strong, unafraid to question. Outside the classroom, Cathy was known for her curiosity. She loved literature, nature, and music. She was not cloistered away from the world. She lived in a small apartment with another nun, Sister Helen Russell Phillips, as part of a pilot program that allowed teaching sisters to live more independently in the community. It was a small change within the church at the time, but to Cathy, it was a way to better understand the lives of her students and neighbors. Those who knew her remember a woman who carried her faith quietly, without judgment or hierarchy. She moved through life with a kind of calm that made others want to protect her. And maybe that is why her disappearance in November 1969 hit Baltimore so hard. It did not fit the person she was. It did not make sense that someone so devoted to others could vanish without a trace. Before the questions, before the rumors and documentaries, there was this, a woman whose kindness shaped hundreds of young lives. The tragedy that followed would shatter that peace, leaving behind decades of unanswered questions. But to understand the weight of what was lost, we have to begin with who she really was: a teacher who believed in goodness, and a sister whose light still lingers, even in the darkest corners of her story. It was a Friday evening, November 7, 1969, cold, ordinary, and uneventful, in the small Baltimore suburb of Catonsville. Sister Cathy Cesnik, 26 years old, had just finished another week of teaching English and drama at Archbishop Keough High School. She lived in a modest apartment complex called the Carriage House, sharing it with another nun, Sister Helen Russell Phillips. That night, Cathy told her she was heading out to run a few quick errands. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have made anyone worry. She drove off in her green Ford Maverick around 7:00 p.m. The plan, as far as anyone knew, was simple: cash, a paycheck. Maybe pick up a few things at a nearby bakery. Routine, almost forgettable. But somewhere in that short window between leaving home and the next morning, Sister Cathy disappeared. The first clue that something was wrong came when her roommate noticed Cathy had not come back. Hours passed. Then the night gave way to dawn. At about 4:00 a.m. the next morning, police found her car parked illegally across the street from her apartment building. The vehicle was slightly muddy, the keys still inside, and a thin layer of leaves clung to its surface as if it had been sitting out in the elements for hours. Inside the car, Police found a few of her belongings, her purse, an uncashed paycheck, and some groceries. It looked as though she would intended to return home that night. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no witnesses who could say what happened after she left the store. To the people who knew her, the disappearance did not make sense. Cathy was not the type to vanish without telling someone. She was careful, disciplined, and had deep connections to her community. For days, volunteers searched nearby woods, fields, and alleys. Flyers went up, parish members prayed, but Baltimore's winter nights grew longer, and still there was no sign of her. The last confirmed sighting placed her at Edmondson Village Shopping Center around 8:30 p.m., cashing her paycheck and possibly buying dinner rolls. After that silence, no screams, no witnesses, no trace. For her students, the news spread like a shockwave through the halls of Keough High School. One of their own mentors, the person who'd stood for trust and safety, had vanished into the night. The police called it a missing person case, but the tone shifted quickly. Within a few days, it was clear they were looking for something darker. The mystery of that night has never truly been solved. Every retelling of the case circles back to those missing hours, the short drive, the car that somehow returned without her, the absence that began as confusion and grew into a wound the city never forgot. For Sister Cathy Cesnik, the quiet streets of Catonsville became the place where an ordinary evening turned into one of Maryland's most enduring enigmas. Nearly 2 months after Sister Cathy Cesnik vanished, winter had settled over Baltimore. The case had gone cold, at least officially. Flyers were fading on telephone poles. Leads had slowed to silence. But on January 3, 1970, 2 men out scavenging for scrap metal in a remote area of Lansdowne, Maryland, stumbled upon something that would end the search and begin another kind of nightmare. There, half buried in frozen dirt and leaves, lay the body of a young woman. Her clothes were still intact, a coat, a skirt, matching shoes. Nearby, a small cross necklace caught the weak winter light. It was Sister Cathy. Police quickly cordoned off the site, but the scene was bleak. In the location, a rugged, trash-strewn embankment was miles from her apartment, deep enough in the outskirts that few would pass by accidentally. Investigators determined she had suffered a single, violent blow to the head, most likely from a blunt object. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been caught off guard or incapacitated before the fatal strike. Her body showed signs of exposure, indicating it had been there for weeks. Despite the time that had passed, the discovery reignited public attention. For many, it confirmed what they had feared, but had not wanted to say aloud, that Sister Cathy had met a violent end. Reporters swarmed the area. Parish members prayed together, candles flickering in the cold. The School Sisters of Notre Dame released a short, careful statement expressing heartbreak and faith. But beneath the words, there was grief mixed with disbelief. How could such harm come to someone whose life had been defined by kindness? Detectives faced a landscape with more questions than answers. How had her car been returned to the apartment without her? Why had no one seen or heard anything that night? And, most haunting of all, who would have wanted to hurt her? In the following days, police examined possible links to another unsolved case, the murder of Joyce Malecki, another young woman found dead 2 days after Cathy disappeared, in a location not far away. Both women were Catholic. Both vanished under mysterious circumstances. Both discovered outdoors. But the official line soon separated the 2 cases, even as locals whispered they might be connected. For Cathy's family and students, the discovery offered no peace. It was an ending without closure. Her funeral drew hundreds of students, teachers, fellow sisters, gathering in quiet disbelief. They spoke of her warmth, her faith, her smile. And yet, the unanswered question hovered above every prayer. Why? From that day forward, her death stopped being just a tragedy. It became a symbol of innocence lost, of truth buried, and of an institution whose silence would soon face deeper scrutiny. The mystery of who killed Sister Cathy would stretch far beyond that cold January morning, unraveling into a story that would expose far more than one unsolved murder. More than half a century has passed since Sister Cathy's body was found, yet her murder file remains open, fragile, incomplete, and full of dead ends. It is one of those cases where time has not brought resolution, only a deeper ache. The police still call it an active investigation, but most of the original detectives are long gone. What remains is a thin stack of evidence, too many missing reports, and a list of theories that read more like questions than answers. From the beginning, the case faced problems. Witness memories blurred, leads contradicted one another, and evidence handling in 1969 lacked the precision modern forensics could have offered. Some documents were lost, others were sealed, and what lingered most was a sense that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. The official narrative never settled. Investigators interviewed local residents, colleagues, and former students. They followed up on the car, the mud on its tires, the groceries still inside, the keys left in the ignition, but no forensic trail could explain how it returned to her apartment complex without her. In the years that followed, small bursts of attention would pull the case briefly into the spotlight: newspaper anniversaries, new interviews, or renewed hope when technology advanced. But each time, the trail grew cold again. The Baltimore County Police, who still oversee the case, have said they are open to new evidence, yet none has led to an arrest. The file has changed hands many times, each new detective inheriting decades of rumor and speculation. The official autopsy points to blunt force trauma, but offers no clues about motive, no fingerprints, no DNA, no confirmed weapon. Just a body left in an isolated dump site, as if the killer knew exactly where she would not be found for weeks. Over time, the unsolved nature of the case became part of its gravity. It was not just about who killed her, it became about why justice never arrived. Generations of her former students, now adults, still speak of her in the present tense, as if refusing to let her vanish again. They have held vigils, pressed investigators, even built online archives to keep the case alive. The mystery endures not because the evidence is strong, but because her story refuses to be forgotten. Every few years, a new lead surfaces: a potential witness, a fresh DNA test, an overlooked document. Each time, hope flickers, and for a moment, it feels like the silence might finally break. But as of today, the murder of Sister Cathy Cesnik remains officially unsolved. No arrests, no confessions, no closure. Just the echo of a question that has haunted Baltimore since 1969. How could a woman so full of grace disappear into violence? And how has her truth stayed buried for so long? The story of Sister Cathy Cesnik does not end with her death. In many ways, that is where it begins to change shape. For decades, her murder was treated as an isolated tragedy. But in the 1,990 seconds, a different narrative began to surface, one whispered by former students who had carried a terrible secret for years. They spoke of Father Anthony Joseph Maskell, the school chaplain at Archbishop Keough High. To outsiders, he was respected, educated, and deeply trusted. To some of the girls he was meant to protect, he was something else entirely. Former students described being summoned to his office under the guise of spiritual counseling, only to face abuse that shattered their faith and sense of safety. These women, now grown, later said that Sister Cathy had begun to notice. She saw the changes in her students, their anxiety, their silence, the way they avoided certain corridors. One student recalled that Cathy had asked gentle but pointed questions, trying to understand what was happening behind closed doors. To her, teaching was not just about lessons, it was about protection. What makes this part of the story so haunting is what it implies. Some believe that Cathy's awareness, or her intention to report the abuse, may have placed her in danger. She was a woman of integrity, in an institution where secrecy had power. If she had uncovered what others were hiding, she might have become a threat to more than one person's reputation. The abuse claims remained buried for years, silenced by fear and shame. It was not until the late 1992 that two women, identified as Jean Wenner, Jane Doe, and Teresa Lancaster, Jane Roe, filed lawsuits against Maskell and the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Their testimonies painted a disturbing picture, not just of one predator, but of a system that had protected him. They alleged that when Sister Cathy tried to intervene, her disappearance followed soon after. Though the link was never proven in court, the timing was chilling. The lawsuit was dismissed due to the statute of limitations, but the stories would not fade. The implications extended far beyond one school. Survivors claimed that Maskell's abuse was part of a larger pattern, one that reached into police departments, parishes, and the archdiocese itself. For many, Cathy's murder became a symbol of what happens when silence is enforced by power. In retrospect, the idea that a young nun might have stood up to that silence and paid the price for it gave her death a tragic kind of meaning. It was not just about violence. It was about conscience. If the stories are true, Sister Cathy Cesnik was killed not because she broke rules, but because she refused to ignore the suffering of others. And even now, that act of quiet courage continues to echo louder than the decades of silence that followed. As the years passed, one name kept returning to the surface of the investigation: Father Anthony Joseph Maskell. He had been the chaplain and counselor at Archbishop Keough High School during the same period that Sister Cathy taught there, and the shadow surrounding him grew longer with every survivor who stepped forward. On paper, Maskell was everything the church prized: well-educated, articulate, deeply embedded in the community. He served as both a spiritual guide and a psychological counselor for the students. But those same credentials also gave him power, the kind that could be misused quietly behind closed doors. When the allegations of abuse became public in the 1992, Maskell denied them all. He claimed that the women who accused him were inventing stories for attention. The church's response, cautious and procedural, placed him on leave, but never resulted in criminal charges. For years, he continued serving in other parishes, shielded by an institution slow to act and quick to protect its own. Yet, the survivors' accounts did not fade. Many of them described how Maskell used intimidation, shame, and manipulation to keep them silent. Some said he invoked religion itself, telling victims that their suffering was part of spiritual purification, or that speaking out would damn their souls. It was psychological control disguised as faith. For investigators, Maskell's proximity to Cathy raised too many questions to ignore. Several students claimed that Cathy had confided in them about her concerns, that she suspected something was wrong at the school, that she was planning to report what she knew. Within weeks, she was gone. When Netflix's The Keepers aired in 2017, Maskell's name once again became central. Public pressure mounted, and that same year, the FBI exhumed his body to collect DNA samples. Many hoped this would finally tie him to the crime scene. But when the results came back, they did not match the evidence found near Cathy's remains. For some, the mismatch was devastating. The first solid scientific lead, gone. For others, it only deepened the mystery. DNA, after all, could only confirm presence, not involvement. Maskell might not have left physical evidence, but the emotional and circumstantial trails pointing toward him remained thick. The investigators never ruled him out. He had motive, access, and a pattern of secrecy that fit the timeline. What kept him beyond the reach of justice was time itself. Too many lost records, too many dead witnesses, too many years of silence. When Maskell died in 2001, he was buried quietly, without resolution, but death did not erase his presence. Every time survivors tell their stories, his name returns not just as a suspect in a murder, but as a symbol of an era when authority could hide behind the pulpit. And so, even in death, Father Maskell remains part of the mystery. His truth, and whatever he might have known about Sister Cathy's fate, lies buried deeper than any grave the Church ever consecrated. In the decades after Sister Cathy's murder, the silence surrounding her death began to crack not from police work, but from the courage of a former student who could no longer keep what she would seen to herself. Her name was Jean Weiner, known publicly as Jane Doe. Jean came forward in the 1,990 seconds with a story that would shock even seasoned investigators. She said that while she was a student at Archbishop Keough High School, she had been repeatedly abused by Father Maskell. But what made her account especially haunting was what she claimed happened one night in late 1969, shortly after Sister Cathy vanished. Jean said Maskell had taken her on a drive. She did not know where they were going, only that he was quiet, tense. They stopped in a wooded area, and he told her to get out of the car. There, she said, she saw something on the ground, the body of a woman. Maskell allegedly told her it was Sister Cathy and warned that this is what happens to people who talk too much. It was a horrifying claim, one impossible to forget once heard. And yet, it arrived decades after the crime, with no physical evidence to prove it. When Jean's story became public, investigators revisited old files, hoping to verify details, the location, the timing, anything that could link her account to the known facts. But the trail had gone too cold. Critics questioned whether her memory, buried for years under trauma, could be trusted. Supporters pointed out that trauma does not erase truth. It buries it until it becomes safe to speak. Forensic experts debated her timeline, noting inconsistencies with the estimated date of Cathy's death. But for many of Cathy's former students, Jean's story resonated in ways that felt too familiar to dismiss. Her testimony reignited public interest, drawing journalists and activists to the case. It also put fresh pressure on the Church and the Baltimore police, who now faced not just an unsolved murder, but the possibility that it had been part of a much larger effort to silence a witness to abuse. Jean's revelation became one of the central moments in The Keepers, the 2017 Netflix documentary that brought the case to a global audience. Her voice, fragile yet firm, became symbolic of every survivor who had been ignored or doubted. The scene she described has never been confirmed, but its emotional truth changed the trajectory of the investigation. It reminded the world that memory, even when fractured, can hold power. And whether or not Jean actually stood beside Sister Cathy's body that night, her willingness to speak reopened doors that had been locked for half a century. In a case built on silence, that one act of remembering was enough to shake the ground beneath an entire institution. As more survivors began to speak, The story of Sister Cathy's murder shifted from a local tragedy to something much larger, a glimpse into the bastion, machinery of silence that had long protected powerful men within the church. What started as whispers about one abusive priest slowly unraveled into a web of secrecy, manipulation, and institutional preservation. The Archdiocese of Baltimore, like many dioceses of the era, maintained a polished image of moral authority. But behind its walls, records were carefully controlled, complaints were quietly redirected, and those who questioned authority were often met with denial or dismissal. When allegations against Father Maskell surfaced, the response followed a familiar pattern: transfer him to another parish, assign him new duties, issue no public statement. The cycle of concealment continued, efficient, bureaucratic, devastating. In the case of Sister Cathy, many now believe that the same forces that shielded abusers also obstructed justice. Detectives in the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds complained privately that key church figures refused to cooperate, citing internal matters. Evidence that might have pointed toward connections between Maskell and Cathy's death was reportedly buried in diocesan archives, shielded from law enforcement under claims of clerical privilege. Survivors later said that some officers themselves were part of that system, attending the same parishes, serving as friends or confidants to church officials, unwilling to challenge the hierarchy that shaped their community. The boundaries between church and law blurred in quiet ways that made accountability nearly impossible. By the time the first civil lawsuits emerged in the 1990 seconds, much of the damage had already been done. Files had gone missing, witnesses had died, and decades of silence had worn down the memory of those who might have helped. The Archdiocese publicly expressed sorrow, but stopped short of admitting responsibility. Legal strategies focused on technical defenses, the statute of limitations, procedural barriers, rather than moral reckoning. For many survivors, this response was more painful than the original abuse. It confirmed what they had suspected all along, that their suffering was less threatening to the church than the truth itself. The idea that a young nun might have tried to expose the abuse and paid the ultimate price was not something the institution was eager to confront. The system that surrounded Sister Cathy was built to endure scandal, not reveal it. It was a structure polished over centuries, where image outweighed transparency and obedience was mistaken for virtue. That culture did not create her killer, but it may have buried the evidence that could have revealed him. In the end, what makes her story so unsettling is not just the crime itself, but how easily it disappeared into paperwork, denials, and decades of controlled silence. The tragedy of Sister Cathy Cesnik is not only that she was murdered, it is that her death exposed a truth the institution was never prepared to face. For nearly 50 years, Sister Cathy's story lingered quietly in Baltimore, an unsolved case, remembered mostly by her former students and a handful of local journalists. Then, in 2017, a documentary changed everything. Netflix released The Keepers, a 7-part series that transformed the decades-old mystery into a global conversation. Unlike other true crime shows, The Keepers did not focus on sensationalism. It gave the story back to the people who had lived it, the women who had once been her students, now grown, still carrying the weight of what they saw and what they suspected. The series followed 2 of them, Gemma Hoskins and Abby Shobe, retired teachers turned amateur investigators, who refused to let Cathy's story fade into another cold case file. They pieced together interviews, documents, and survivor accounts, working with a persistence that shamed official investigations. What they uncovered was not a simple mystery. It was a pattern. Connections between Cathy's death, the allegations of abuse, and a larger system of silence began to form. For many viewers, the horror was not just the murder, but the decades of avoidance that followed. The documentary landed at a time when public trust in institutions was already fraying, and its impact was immediate. The church's response was defensive, but the public's was empathetic. Survivors from across the country began contacting journalists, sharing stories that echoed what the women from Keough High had endured. The investigation, once buried under bureaucracy and fear, now had global attention. Baltimore police were forced to issue new statements. The Archdiocese released partial files, though critics said they remained selective and incomplete. News outlets revisited the timeline, and viewers worldwide became part of the conversation, analyzing clues, circulating theories, demanding accountability. For Cathy's former students, the recognition was bittersweet. After decades of shouting into the void, people were finally listening. But the renewed attention also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Jean Wayner's testimony was dissected online, every inconsistency magnified. Survivors who had lived quietly for years found themselves reliving trauma in public view. Still, the impact of the keepers was undeniable. It reignited an investigation that had gone dormant for nearly half a century and gave a face and voice to victims the church had tried to forget. Cathy Cesnik's name, once buried under official indifference, became a rallying cry, not just for justice, but for truth. And in a strange, almost poetic way, the woman who had devoted her life to helping others find their voices ended up doing the same long after her death. Through the persistence of her students and the power of storytelling, Sister Cathy finally became heard, not as a victim, but as a symbol of what courage can uncover when silence breaks. After the keepers, the case could no longer be quietly ignored. The public wanted progress, and survivors wanted accountability. In 2024 and 2025, the Maryland Attorney General's Office released a sweeping report on decades of abuse within the Archdiocese of Baltimore, a document more than 450 pages long, naming over 150 clergy members accused of misconduct. Buried within that report were references and timelines that echoed familiar names and locations tied to Sister Cathy's world. While it did not directly solve her murder, it confirmed what many had long believed: the abuse at Archbishop Keough High School was real, systematic, and covered up by those in power. Investigators publicly stated that they were reviewing portions of the AG report for leads that might intersect with Cathy's case. Survivors hoped that unsealed grand jury testimony could reveal who might have silenced her in 1969. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and decades-old evidence even slower. Meanwhile, the Archdiocese's 2025 bankruptcy filing, a legal move meant to manage the growing number of abuse claims, reopened questions about transparency. Lawyers representing survivors argued that the bankruptcy process could once again hide key documents, including records potentially relevant to Cathy's murder. Court hearings in late 2025 became emotional battlegrounds, with survivors standing up in public sessions to demand that the church finally release everything it knows. There is also renewed interest from forensic specialists who believe modern DNA and genealogical methods could still be applied to trace unknown profiles from the original crime scene evidence. Police officials have said they remain open to collaboration, but as of now, no new matches or arrests have been announced. Every few months, another article, podcast, or vigil brings Cathy's name back into the light. Each time, the tone shifts slightly less about mystery, more about justice deferred. For the survivors, the slow progress feels like walking through fog. They can see hints of the truth, but never the full picture. Still, there is a quiet resilience running through it all. Cathy's former students, now in their 70s, continue to press for answers. They hold memorials, send letters to lawmakers, and remind the public that unsolved does not mean forgotten. So, while there has not been a breakthrough, there has been movement, the kind that happens when silence finally cracks. The truth, like Cathy's memory, keeps surfacing, not as an ending, but as a promise that her story will not be buried again. As official investigation stalled, the courtroom became the next battleground. For many of Sister Cathy's former students, justice could no longer depend on police departments or the church hierarchy. So they turned to the civil courts not just to seek damages, but to demand acknowledgement. In the mid-1992s, two women, Jean Weiner and Teresa Lancaster, filed lawsuits against Father Maskell and the Archdiocese of Baltimore. They claimed years of sexual abuse and psychological manipulation, alleging that Maskell had used his authority as a priest and school counselor to prey on vulnerable students. Their suit also pointed to a wider culture of protection within the church, a pattern where complaints were ignored and offenders quietly reassigned. But the legal system at the time was not built to handle such cases. The statute of limitations for abuse in Maryland had long expired. The church's attorneys moved quickly, arguing that the claims were too old to pursue. In 1995, the case was dismissed not because the evidence lacked weight, but because the law refused to look backward. Still, the lawsuits had an effect. They cracked open the seal of silence. For the first time, public records mentioned names, dates, and places that had lived only in whispers. Journalists began connecting the threads, and police were forced to revisit files long buried in storage. The civil case had failed, but its echo reached farther than anyone expected. Over the next decades, survivors pushed for legal reform. Their persistence helped fuel changes to Maryland law, expanding or eliminating the statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse. That work bore fruit decades later. In 2023, Maryland passed the Child Victims Act, allowing survivors to file claims regardless of how much time had passed. By 2024 and 2025, dozens of new lawsuits had been filed under the new law, naming the archdiocese and individual clergy. Many of those filings reference the same network of abuse that surrounded Archbishop Keough High and, by extension, the same world Sister Cathy had inhabited. Some lawyers even argued that the truth about her death might finally emerge through discovery in those civil cases, as sealed church records were forced into the open. Meanwhile, the archdiocese filed for bankruptcy, a move critics called a shield against full accountability. Survivors objected, saying it risked hiding evidence all over again. Court hearings became emotional and raw, a collision between legal process and human pain. For many of Cathy's former students, the courtroom is no longer about retribution. It is about recognition, proving that what happened in those halls was not imagined, that their teacher's death was not meaningless. They are not chasing one man anymore. They are confronting a structure. And though the church continues to frame the cases as matters of financial resolution, the survivors see something deeper at stake. In every testimony, in every page of legal filing, there is a quiet echo of Sister Cathy's voice, the one that spoke up for them when no one else would. Today, more than 5 decades after her death, the murder of Sister Cathy Cesnik remains officially unsolved. The Baltimore County Police keep the case open, though their public statements are measured, almost cautious. They say they are still reviewing leads, still willing to test new evidence if it appears. But for those who followed the case, that feels less like progress and more like a quiet admission that justice may never come through the institutions that failed her. And yet, the story has not faded. In the years since the Keepers, the people who knew and loved Cathy have built their own kind of investigation, one made of memory, community, and persistence. Her former students continue to write letters to lawmakers, file new records requests, and push for the unsealing of documents that could reveal who silenced her. Each effort is a way of saying she mattered, and that truth, even delayed, is still worth chasing. For the survivors of abuse tied to the same school, the case carries a different kind of meaning. It is both a mirror and a warning proof of what happens when institutions protect power instead of people. Many of them say they see Cathy as a symbol of moral courage, a woman who stood for compassion and conscience in a system that punished both. The church, meanwhile, remains caught between acknowledgement and avoidance. Statements of regret are issued, legal filings continue, but the sense of accountability still feels distant. Documents remain sealed. Names stay redacted. The wound stays open. What endures is something deeper than an investigation, a collective refusal to let her story disappear. Every candlelight vigil, every anniversary article, every whispered prayer in Baltimore's cold winter air keeps her memory alive. In that sense, Cathy Cesnik has never really been silenced. She may not have lived to see the truth she sought, but her legacy has outlasted the walls that tried to contain it. The questions surrounding her death remain. Who killed her? Who knew? And why? They stayed silent, but so does the echo of what she represented: kindness, courage, and the quiet conviction that light belongs in even the darkest places. And perhaps that is the closest thing to justice left in this story, that a single teacher's faith in truth continues to move others to search for it, long after the world stopped listening. When you step back from the details, the names, the timelines, the hearings, and what remains of Sister Cathy Cesnik's story is not just a mystery, but a mirror. It reflects how courage and silence can exist side by side in the same world, and how truth can survive long after institutions have tried to bury it. Her life was about teaching and compassion, not confrontation. Yet in trying to protect her students, she became part of a story that revealed the deepest fractures in the very faith she served. Half a century later, we still do not know who took her life, but we do know what she stood for: honesty, empathy, and the quiet belief that justice, however slow, is still worth fighting for. The case endures because her legacy does. Every effort to uncover the truth, every survivor who speaks, every student who remembers, is part of the light she left behind. Thank you for spending time with this story. Whether you came here for the mystery or for the meaning behind it, may it remind you that truth rarely disappears. It just waits for someone brave enough to look again. See you in the next story, where history still whispers and we keep listening.